Donald Trump maybe is shifting his mindset because perhaps he sees Ukraine as now the winners.
I was told exactly that this isn't that he's changed his mind about Putin and Russia and authoritarianism and aggression, but that he likes to go with a winner.
That's Senator Chris Coons, a senior Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee, a strong supporter of US aid to Ukraine, and regular visitor to the country since the war began. He's describing, in his own words, what he thinks is driving President Trump's position on Vladimir Putin, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and the war in Ukraine right now. And it's not that the president is experiencing some sort of big ideological shift, moving away from Russia towards Ukraine. He thinks that the president is being dictated by what he's seeing on the battlefield. In our most recent FourSight, we explained how Ukrainian drone strikes are taking the war to Russia's heartlands. Ukraine's aim isn't just to destroy military targets, but to disrupt the supply chains that keep Russia's army fighting and inflict damage across the whole nation's economy and bring the consequences of the war closer to home. But while we look at how Ukraine has found an edge in its offensive, we dig also into their major weaknesses too. Russia continues to bombard Ukrainian cities with ballistic missiles, and Kyiv needs more US-made Patriot air defenses to defend them. At the NATO summit, Trump suggested letting Ukraine have that technology.
We're going to give a license to you to make Patriots. That's pretty cool, right?
So I'm speaking with one of the key politicians pushing for further US support for Kyiv. Can Ukraine get those Patriot air defenses they so desperately need? Can Congress persuade the president to ratchet up pressure on Russia? Those are some of the questions I put to Senator Chris Coons, lovely to meet you, in this special interview for FourSight. Senator Coons, President Zelenskyy says the shortage of Patriots is Russia's last major advantage. President Trump has floated letting Ukraine build perhaps their own Patriots. That was at the NATO summit. But it was quite vague and that would take years. How can Ukraine, or can it survive without Patriots?
Ukraine has remarkably survived day after day of brutal bombardment by advanced hypersonics and ballistic missiles. They've been taking the punishment in terms of lost lives and in terms of damage to their energy grid and to civilian apartment buildings and infrastructure. They would do much better if they had more Patriot interceptors. They've got lots of launchers. The issue is the PAC-3 missiles, which they've come down to a very, very low number. They are very capable at tracking, intercepting, and knocking down Shahed drones, which Iran has manufactured for Russia in huge quantity. It is the much more exquisite, expensive, and rare ballistic missiles that they cannot intercept without PAC-3s. I think we should be sending them to them as quickly as possible because Ukraine has the momentum on the battlefield, and a combination of the Trump administration actually imposing sanctions on Russia and the buyers of Russian oil and on sanctions evaders, and giving Ukraine the PAC-3 interceptors they need and deserve, could resolve this war in a matter of weeks, if not months at the most.
Is there any chance of the Trump administration giving those PAC-3s?
Chance, yes. Am I confident they will? No. Because every time Trump suddenly becomes persuaded that maybe we should side with those who are fighting for freedom, Zelenskyy and the Ukrainians, he has a call with Putin and changes his mind again. But as of the NATO summit in Ankara, Zelenskyy was very optimistic. What the president and his defense national security team was presenting was, here's what we've been able to accomplish in Crimea in a month. We think we can accomplish the same thing much more broadly, much more deeply in Russia, and force them to the negotiating table on favorable terms in 3 months. And here's what we need to do that.
You'd always told, for example, President Biden to allow Ukraine to strike inside Russia, and he'd resisted that.
Yes.
Ukraine are now showing resolve, ingenuity when it comes to drones. They're striking inside Russia. In some ways, they were restrained before because America were telling them no.
They were allowed under the Biden administration to strike inside Russia, but in a limited range. President Biden and his senior foreign policy national security team had real concerns about escalation. He had access to intelligence on the Russians, and they're thinking that I didn't.
Was that a mistake?
That he had access to intelligence? No, he was the president.
To not allow Ukraine to have made these strikes, which we are now seeing, makes so much difference, to really threaten the Russian economy,
There is a balance that any president has to make between concern about escalation, given Putin's massive inventory of nuclear weapons and repeated public expression of a willingness to do so, and a desire to shorten the war and to allow the Ukrainians to win. I've consistently advocated for more weapons earlier with more range.
Senator Coons has supported Ukraine since the outbreak of the war, when President Biden, once a senator from Delaware just like Coons, gave his full backing to the cause. During the Biden administration, more than $170 billion of weapons and humanitarian aid was given to Ukraine.
Please welcome President-elect Donald J. Trump.
When Donald Trump came to power, things changed dramatically. This famous meeting at the White House in February last year marked a decisive shift, with Trump subsequently suspending all military aid to Ukraine.
You're gambling with World War III.
6 months later, he invited Putin to Alaska, hoping to broker a ceasefire, but it didn't work.
We haven't quite got there, but we've made some headway.
The US still refuses to supply direct military support to Kyiv, only allowing hardware to be bought by its NATO allies and sent to Ukraine. Europe has stepped in to fill that gap, and Ukraine has leaned harder on drone warfare to hold the line. Now, Senator Coons and his colleagues have passed a new sanctions bill against Russia, with the measure receiving bipartisan support. Your proposed Russian sanctions bill is promising bone-crushing pressure on Moscow. But, we've seen before that Russia's managed to dodge existing sanctions by rerouting oil exports through third countries. What's different this time with this bill? And why should anyone, in particular Ukraine, believe that this one will work?
Well, at the end of the day, the will of President Trump to actually use the sanctions authority he has, or new authorities this bill, if passed, would give him, his will to actually impose costs on Putin and Russia is what's most important. I do think having a strong bipartisan bill that passes Congress and goes to his desk and says, over to you, Mr. President, is a bit of a forcing mechanism. This bill would strengthen his hand in terms of imposing both sanctions and tariffs on the major importers of oil and gas and the major facilitators of sanction evasion. But frankly, President Trump has only imposed significant secondary sanctions on the Russian oil and gas sector once, and there was big movement quickly as a result. I just think he needs to use the authorities he's got. But if giving him additional authorities, frankly, in memory of Senator Graham, and as a way to push with a bipartisan message, I think would be a positive. President Zelenskyy specifically said, passing this bill and getting your president to sign it would, if nothing else, help strengthen the morale and the momentum of the Ukrainian troops fighting every day.
Is your concern, though, still that even if the mood music is that President Trump is changing his opinion, that might be different in another month or two?
Of course.
And is that makes your job in many ways impossible, does it not? When it
Challenging.
Challenging.
It's hard to chart a course on where President Trump will be. I'll remind you, a generational bill for housing policy passed the House, passed the Senate, big bipartisan vote. I was in local government, provincial or county government before I got here. This would have been a significant game changer in housing policy. And there was a great big signing ceremony all set up, and Trump was saying how this was great and it was gonna, fight housing costs. And then he changed his mind, canceled the bill signing, started denouncing it, refused to sign it. It has become law without his signature, a very rare thing in modern American legislative history. But it's a reminder how mercurial he can be, even on something like housing costs that polls as a very broad concern across the country. So predicting where he's going to be on Ukraine and Russia and sanctions is every bit as hard as predicting whether he's going to sign a bill championed by his own party.
Often when I've spoken to other European leaders and figures about the war and how it might possibly end, they've often said it will end in Moscow with a change there. Your sanctions bill is aimed at oligarchs, for example, and we've seen some like Andrei Melnichenko come out and call for the war to end. Is that significant? Do you think that potentially the oligarchs, the elites around Putin, could be trying to move to force him not to escalate, not to mobilize, to actually try and reach some sort of diplomacy?
I think that's entirely possible. Look, the costs and the consequences of the war have been kept carefully away from the centers of power in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And part of what has such impact of Ukraine's recent successful long-range drone strikes isn't just that they're taking out major oil refineries. It's that the residents of Moscow and St. Petersburg are in very long lines for petrol and seeing huge explosions and flames. There is no better defended place in all of Russia than Moscow. And the fact that the May Day parade had to be shortened and because of fear that the Ukrainians would strike critical munitions and critical military capabilities. The Ukrainians are hitting the Russians in ways that are now being noticed in the capital, and that matters.
Is there an irony here, though, that the minute the Trump administration came in and started to, withhold funding and support for Ukraine, that's when we've seen Ukraine step up when it comes to drones, step up to their own ingenuity, really start winning on the battlefield? There's an irony, is there not, that it took American support to ebb away, American threats of saying don't strike too far into Russia, for Ukraine to get the upper hand?
I'm not sure I buy that causal link. Remember that, yes, Trump scared and upset and alarmed all of us by briefly withholding intelligence sharing and largely withholding munitions. Europe stepped up. I was at the NATO summit in The Hague last summer, and it was perfectly clear that our European allies and Canada said, Russia's a real threat. We cannot afford to step back, and made and have kept serious commitments about providing munitions and funding and partnership. There is a Pearl program through which European funds purchase American weapons and munitions, and they're delivered to Ukraine. But that pivot was one where it's not as if America withdraws and then Ukraine finds its moxie. America became less fully supportive. Europe really stepped forward, and Ukraine has managed to win the day so far in the battlefield. And I'm very optimistic now that Ukraine can end this war on just and durable terms.
If Democrats took the House and the Senate in November, what could you do to really change things for Ukraine, if anything? Or what could you force the administration to do? Would November change things?
Hopefully it will. But there is broad bipartisan support for Russia and Ukraine to be brought to a just conclusion by actively and affirmatively supporting Ukraine in the Senate. I have been struck at meeting after meeting how senior Republican senators have really pushed the Trump administration on why are you not spending, why are you not partnering, why are you not helping us learn the lessons of this war? So if we had the majority, we'd have more tools to use. But frankly, it says something about Trump's intransigence and his commitment to supporting Putin rather than supporting the free people of Ukraine, that he has resisted so much pressure, and his military leadership has resisted so much pressure from his own party's leadership.
Senator Coons, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to Senator Coons for all of his time and his expertise, and to his staff for making the interview happen, in particular to Maddie. What did you make of what he said? Do you agree that President Trump is mercurial? And do you think that more US support could be really decisive when it comes to this conflict? Let us know what you think, and as always, make sure you subscribe for the next episode of FourSight.